A president signs a veto that kills a bank. A president prints money the bankers refuse to lend him. A president goes on television and cuts the dollar loose from gold forever. 3 different presidents, 3 completely different centuries, and underneath it all, the exact same fight. Welcome back to Dollar Cents a Z. We've already told you how a hidden meeting gave America its modern central bank, and how that young institution faced its first great test in 1929. But nearly a century before the Federal Reserve was born, American presidents were already going to war with the country's money system, and they would keep doing it again and again for the next 140 years. Tonight, 3 stories in one. A president who killed a bank, a president who printed his own money to avoid one, and a president who cut the dollar loose from gold entirely. Every time the question was the same: should the power to control a nation's money sit with the people its citizens elect, or with the institutions that manage it? To understand how this fight kept returning, we have to start at the very beginning, with a country so young it couldn't even agree on what money was. After the War of 1812, the United States was a patchwork of competing paper currencies, and few people trusted any of it for long. In 1816, Congress chartered the Second Bank of the United States, hoping one strong institution could bring order to the chaos. In 1823, a brilliant, refined Philadelphian named Nicholas Biddle took charge of the bank and set out to make it the most disciplined institution in the country. To be fair to him, it worked. Under Biddle, reckless state banks were reined in, and the country had, for the first time, something close to a stable national currency. But the bank was privately owned, and Biddle himself, a man no one had ever elected, now decided who could borrow and who could not. In a modest dry goods shop nearby, a hopeful young merchant depended entirely on credit from banks tied to Biddle's system, grateful for the stability it brought him. Far to the west, a very different man had learned to distrust paper money the hard way. As a young businessman, Andrew Jackson had once been nearly ruined by debt and speculation. Jackson became a national hero after the Battle of New Orleans, and in 1828, he was elected president as an outsider who promised to break the grip of distant elites. Jackson's objection to the bank was not personal spite. He genuinely believed that no institution beyond the reach of voters should hold that much power over ordinary lives. In his very first message to Congress in 1829, years before the bank's charter was even due, Jackson quietly questioned whether it should exist at all. In Philadelphia, Nicholas Biddle read the message and dismissed it, certain that a frontier soldier could not possibly understand the delicate machinery of national finance. Senator Henry Clay, preparing to challenge Jackson for president, saw his chance, convinced Biddle to apply for the bank's recharter 4 years early, and forced Jackson to either sign a popular bill or veto it and hand Clay a campaign weapon. Biddle hesitated, but ultimately trusted that his institution was simply too useful, too respected, for any president to attack directly. He agreed to the early request. In January of 1832, the recharter bill was formally introduced in Congress, 4 years before it was actually needed. In June of 1832, Congress passed the recharter bill by a comfortable margin. Its supporters were confident that no president would dare veto it. The bill reached his desk, and according to those closest to him, Jackson turned to Martin Van Buren and said simply that the bank was trying to kill him, but that he would kill it first. The message argued that the bank served the rich and powerful at the expense of ordinary, common Americans, one of the boldest populist arguments any president had ever made. On July 10, 1832, Andrew Jackson signed the veto, formally refusing to renew the bank's charter. In Philadelphia, Nicholas Biddle read the veto message in disbelief, privately calling it a manifesto of anarchy. Furious, Biddle ordered the veto message printed and distributed by the thousands as campaign propaganda, certain its harsh words would frighten voters away from Jackson. It did the opposite. The veto became the defining issue of the 1832 campaign. Clay called Jackson reckless and ignorant of finance. Jackson's supporters called the bank a monster threatening the common people. In November, Andrew Jackson won a commanding landslide over Henry Clay and read it as a mandate from the people themselves to finish what the veto had started. In 1833, rather than wait for the charter to expire, Jackson ordered something no president had done before: pull the federal government's own deposits out of the bank entirely. Two of his own Treasury secretaries, in turn, balked at the order, calling it reckless. Jackson removed them both, one after another, an unprecedented use of presidential power that alarmed even some of his own allies. Finally, Roger Taney, Jackson's loyal attorney general, agreed to carry out the order as the new Treasury Secretary. Federal deposits began flowing out of the Marble Hall in Philadelphia and into a growing list of state banks, soon nicknamed the President's Pet Banks. Watching his deposits drain away, Nicholas Biddle chose retaliation. He began deliberately tightening credit across the entire bank system, calling in loans nationwide. In fairness to him, Biddle likely believed real economic pain would force Congress and Jackson to relent and restore his bank. It was a gamble, not simple spite. Almost overnight, businesses across the country found their credit suddenly called in or refused outright. Panic spread through counting houses everywhere. The young merchant's own credit line was abruptly called in. For the first time, the fight in Washington had reached his own shop counter. Alarmed merchants and bankers traveled to Washington by the dozens, pleading with Jackson to relent and restore the deposits before the damage grew worse. Jackson reportedly told one such delegation to go plead with Nicholas Biddle instead. He himself would never restore the deposits. Slowly, public sympathy began to shift. Instead of blaming Jackson for the pain, more people began to see Biddle's tactics as proof of exactly the kind of unchecked power Jackson had warned about. In March of 1834, the Senate took an extraordinary step, formally censuring Jackson for what it called an unlawful assumption of power, the only time in history a sitting president has been censured this way. Jackson responded with a formal protest of his own, dismissing the censure as an illegitimate overreach by a Senate that had exceeded its proper role. Years later, in January of 1837, Jackson's Senate ally, Thomas Hart Benton, finally succeeded in having the censure formally struck from the record, a symbolic final victory near the very end of Jackson's presidency. By then, Biddle had long since eased his credit squeeze under pressure from his own board, but the damage was done. In 1836, the second bank's federal charter formally expired, and Congress did not renew it. Rather than close entirely, Biddle secured a new charter from the state of Pennsylvania, keeping his bank alive, but only as one state institution among many. Without a strong national anchor, banking slid back into a wild patchwork of competing currencies. The young merchant, once grateful for a stable currency, found himself sorting through a confusing pile of notes again. In 1837, a severe nationwide financial panic struck under Jackson's hand-picked successor, Martin Van Buren. Driven by a tangle of causes, with unstable credit and currency chief among them. In 1841, Biddle's own Pennsylvania bank collapsed in scandal and failure, a bitter, unglamorous end to the institution that had once ruled the nation's credit. The Grand Hall that had once controlled the nation's money now stood quiet, its marble columns still standing, its purpose gone. This was the first time a president had beaten the bankers. It would not be the last. 3 decades later, the country's finances looked nothing like Jackson's era. A small, modest treasury office in Washington managed a government that had never imagined paying for a war of this size. In April of 1861, the Civil War began, and the Union suddenly needed more money, faster than the government had ever raised in its history. Treasury Secretary Salmon Chase faced an impossible number, one that grew larger with every week the war continued. A syndicate of New York bankers offered to lend the government the money it needed, but at interest rates so high, they would have crippled the Treasury for years to come. Abraham Lincoln reviewed the terms with Chase and refused them outright. The government, he said, needed a way to pay for this war that did not put it entirely at the mercy of a handful of bankers. An idea began circulating among Lincoln's advisors. Let the government print its own paper money directly and simply declare it legal tender for debts, backed by nothing but the promise of the United States itself. In Congress, hard money believers warned that paper backed by nothing but government promises would destroy the currency's value entirely. For weeks, the Capitol argued over whether the government had any right to declare paper money legal tender at all, a question no one had ever had to answer before. In February of 1862, Congress passed the Legal Tender Act, authorizing the Treasury to issue paper currency directly for the first time in the nation's history. Within weeks, the Treasury's printing room was running day and night, producing a new kind of paper money, printed with green ink on the back, soon nicknamed the Greenback. In a modest home outside Washington, a soldier's wife received her husband's army pay for the first time in the new greenbacked bills, relieved, but uncertain what they were really worth. Shopkeepers weren't sure what to make of the new currency either. Some accepted it at full value. Others quietly discounted it, unsure it would hold. Whatever its risks, the greenback did exactly what Lincoln needed. The Union could now pay its soldiers and suppliers without waiting on a syndicate of bankers and their terms. But as more greenbacks were printed to keep pace with the war's growing cost, prices at home slowly began to climb. At the market, the soldier's wife noticed her husband's pay didn't stretch quite as far as it used to. On a hushed New York exchange floor nicknamed the Gold Room, traders speculated openly on the shifting price of gold against the new paper currency, some growing rich on the very uncertainty ordinary families were living through. For the rest of the war, the country effectively lived with two prices for everything, one in gold and a higher one in greenbacks, a visible measure of how much trust the paper currency had or hadn't earned. Lincoln himself defended the greenbacks publicly as a necessary wartime measure, never claiming it should become a permanent way of making money. The war dragged into its third and fourth years, and the printing presses kept running, the currency continuing to slide in value against gold. In 1863, Congress went a step further, passing the National Banking Act to create a new system of federally chartered banks across the country. For the first time, the federal government imposed a heavy tax on the old competing state banknotes, driving them out of circulation entirely. For the first time since Jackson killed the second bank 3 decades earlier, the country was moving back toward a single, federally anchored currency system. In April of 1865, the Civil War finally ended. But the legal argument over the greenbacks the war had created was only just beginning. In 1870, the Supreme Court ruled narrowly that Congress had lacked the constitutional power to make the greenbacks legal tender for debts made before the law existed. In an odd historical twist, the opinion was written by Chief Justice Salmon Chase, the very man who, as Treasury Secretary, had championed the greenbacks into existence in the first place. The ruling didn't stand for long. Within about a year, after the court's makeup changed, the legal tender cases of 1871 reversed course, upholding Congress's power to issue paper currency going forward. Years later, older now, the soldier's wife still kept a single worn greenback bill in a small box, faded but still spendable, a quiet reminder of what her family had lived through. Unlike Jackson, Lincoln never destroyed a bank. He simply made the government able to do without one, at least for a while. a very different way of winning the same kind of fight. The Greenbacks helped win a war, but the inflation and instability they caused along the way fell hardest on ordinary families, the kind who had no say in how the money was made. By the end of the century, the single gold coin from Jackson's era and Lincoln's paper greenback existed side by side. Two very different ideas of what money could be, both still unresolved. Decades later, the single gold coin and the greenback dollar had both given way to something new, a modern paper note, still promising on its face that it could be exchanged for gold. In 1944, the world's major nations had agreed on a new system. The US dollar would be tied to gold at a fixed rate, and every other currency would be tied to the dollar. It worked because the world trusted one simple promise: any nation holding dollars could exchange them for American gold on demand at a fixed price. By the late 1960s, years of war spending and rising domestic costs had sent far more dollars out into the world than the promise was built to handle. Foreign governments, holding more dollars than they were entirely comfortable with, began quietly asking a hard question: was America's gold promise still good? France, under Finance Minister Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, began formally redeeming its dollar reserves for American gold, exactly as the rules allowed. Ship by ship, America's gold reserves in Fort Knox and New York began quietly shrinking. In Washington, aides briefed the Nixon administration on the shrinking gold stock with growing urgency. Treasury Secretary John Connally, blunt and confident, argued it was time for decisive action, whatever the world thought of it. Federal Reserve Chairman Arthur Burns, more cautious, warned that any sudden move could shake confidence in the dollar itself. In August of 1971, Nixon summoned his closest economic advisors to a secluded weekend meeting at Camp David, away from the press and from Congress. Three options lay before them: raise the price of gold, formally devalue the dollar, or cut the connection between the dollar and gold entirely. Nixon chose the boldest option of the three: end gold convertibility completely, immediately, without warning anyone outside the room. On the evening of Sunday, August the 15th, 1971, television sets across the country switched on for an unscheduled presidential address. Nixon announced a sweeping wage and price freeze and a new tax on imported goods, framing it all as decisive action to protect the American dollar. And then, almost as an aside, he announced the part that would truly change the world. The United States would no longer exchange dollars for gold, for anyone, on demand. For decades, an actual teller-style window at the Treasury had let foreign governments exchange dollars for gold in person. Now, quietly, its shutter was closed. Overseas, finance ministries scrambled. Phones rang through the night in capitals that had built their entire currency systems around America's broken promise. Even America's closest allies had not been told in advance. The secrecy that had protected the decision at Camp David now left the rest of the world blindsided. For the first time in the nation's history, the American dollar was backed by nothing but trust in the government that issued it. In the months that followed, the world's major currencies stopped being fixed to one another and began, for the first time, to float freely against each other. The Grand Conference Hall, where the old system had been built in 1944, now stood empty and dusty, its purpose quietly over. At home, an American family noticed prices at the grocery counter creeping steadily upward in the years that followed. The 1970s that followed brought long lines at gas stations and years of high inflation, caused by many overlapping forces, with the end of the gold-backed dollar as one thread among several. Historians still debate which it really was: a necessary fix to an unsustainable system, or a fuse lit under a decade of instability that followed. Arthur Burns himself, by most accounts, had preferred smaller, more gradual steps and privately worried about how far the final decision went. In fairness, it did solve something real. It ended an unsustainable run on America's gold reserves that could not have continued much longer either way. But it also removed the last hard constraint on how much money could be created, a factor most economists agree contributed to the high inflation of the following decade. Every dollar printed since that Sunday night has been backed by nothing but trust in the government that issues it. The final chapter in a story that began with Andrew Jackson's gold coin. So there it is. A veto, a printing press, a television address, 3 presidents, 3 different tools, one recurring fight over who really controls a nation's money. Now, the part most retellings of stories like these tend to skip. Myth. Andrew Jackson permanently ended the idea of a central bank in America. Fact. His fight simply opened a window that later closed again, first with Lincoln's national banking system, and then, as we told you in an earlier episode, with a new central bank born in secret on a Georgia island in 1910. Myth. Lincoln's greenbacks were simple, illegitimate, funny money. Fact. The argument over whether Congress even had the constitutional power to create them occupied the Supreme Court for nearly a decade, and the country's own top court changed its mind. Myth, and an important one to clear up, that a young president once secretly signed an order to abolish the Federal Reserve and was killed for it soon after. Fact. John F. Kennedy's Executive Order 11,110, signed in 1963, simply adjusted authority over a small, already existing class of Treasury silver certificates. It did not attempt to abolish the Federal Reserve, and mainstream historians find no credible link between that order and his assassination. Myth. Nixon's move in 1971 permanently solved the dollar's problems. Fact. It ended one crisis, a run on America's gold, and helped open the door to a different one, a decade of high inflation that followed, a veto pen, a printing press, a television broadcast, different centuries, different tools, but every time a president reaching for power, the bankers and financiers believed belonged to them. Some historians see all 3 moments the same way. Elected leaders, accountable to voters, correctly asserting control over a system that would otherwise answer to no one at the ballot box. Others point to the same 3 moments and see real damage. A banking system thrown into chaos in the 1830s, inflation that ate into ordinary wages in the 1860s, and a decade of economic turbulence that began in the 1970s. Perhaps in every single one of these fights, both things were true at once. A genuine assertion of democratic power and a genuinely costly one. That complexity, more than any tidy verdict, is the honest takeaway. Every dollar you hold today carries the scars of all 3 fights. A currency that survived a bank war, a war economy, and the end of gold itself, and is still, in a sense, being argued over. So ask yourself, the way historians still do, in each of these moments, were these presidents defending ordinary people from unaccountable financial power, or overreaching in ways that left the country worse off? Maybe the honest answer changes depending on which one you're asking about. If you enjoyed this one, subscribe for the rest of the series and tell us in the comments which of these 3 fights you find most convincing and which one you think went too far. Next time on Money and Power, Hidden History, we go back to the very question that closed tonight's story. What actually gives paper money its value once it's no longer backed by anything you can hold in your hand?